none of which had much of anything directly to do with non-fiction prose or with affairs or persuasion. Now, some departments continued to teach composition, but composition was no longer required for 2, 3, or 4 years the way it once was at Harvard. Composition was whittled down into the first year, and then it was whittled down into one term of the first year, our expos, which the Department of English for many decades has not had anything to do with, because many departments of English thought teaching composition is somebody else's job. I don't believe that myself, obviously, but that is what happened with a lot of departments that taught literature and language. Where did the teaching of rhetoric survive in higher education in the United States? It survived in a very interesting place. It survived generally in public institutions. It survived in institutions that were granted their status under the Morrill Act of the 1860s. Land grant institutions, state universities. Penn State would be an example, University of Michigan, Ohio State. These are the places that still to this day have very large and powerful and very often very fine rhetoric departments, or they have very strong wings of rhetoric within their literature departments. Why was it considered important for these land grant universities to teach rhetoric? Because they were turning out graduates who were going to be involved in public affairs. They were turning out graduates who were going to be working in the real world of science, agriculture, business, government, and law, and medicine eventually too. So these state institutions felt that they had a public responsibility to teach what they regarded as a publicly important subject, rhetoric, and what we have come to call public speaking. Now that simplifies the history quite a bit, but there's certainly a kernel of truth to it. The Ivy League institutions and the elite selective colleges systematically dropped the study of rhetoric and shrunk it down into the study of the study of composition. And they shrunk that down into one course in the first year. And then they shrunk that down into one term in the first year. And that's very valuable, it's very important, but people don't learn to become the best writers that they could be simply by taking one course for 12 weeks. It's a help, it's important, it's good, but it's not enough. It just isn't. You have to keep it up on your own, you have to get help, you have to continue practicing. So elite institutions in this country actually help depress the importance of the study of rhetoric and, in general, also of composition, relegating it to a position in which the people who taught it were considered to be less distinguished in their academic appointments, in which they were paid considerably less, in which they were very often not given tenure, and in which they were considered to be, as it used to be said, seated below the salt, meaning at a big table you'd get a less important seat way away from the head of the table. That's just a fact. And that persistence occurred and lasted all the way through the 20th century. And only fairly recently have institutions come to their senses again and said, wait, maybe we really should teach public speaking. Maybe we really should continue with composition for a longer period of time, and maybe we should reintroduce a more formal study of rhetoric. And indeed, some places have started to do that now, and have done so over the last 10 to 15 years. In addition to which, whole schools, called schools of communication, have grown up to help take up the slack. So BU, for example, has a school of communication. Northwestern University in Illinois has a very famous school of communication. And very often these schools of communication, which give undergraduate as well as graduate degrees, teach rhetoric and public speaking. I myself think that part of a liberal arts and sciences education has to pay attention to it for reasons I've mentioned before. But it is the very elite places, including this one, which have to take some responsibility for pushing it out of the curriculum. Anyone here take XBOS 40 or is taking XBOS 40? That's a course which didn't exist 15 years ago. And now I understand it's oversubscribed, meaning more people want to take it than can take it because they don't have enough people to teach it. That's not a good thing, but actually offering it is a wonderful thing. Because public speaking wasn't offered in any form at the university for a period of about 30 years, from the 70s until about 2000. I think Lowell House has a program in rhetoric and speaking, does it? Yes? Have you attended?
I think annually, every year, there's like Lowell speeches where people get help from tutors and other people to craft a speech. So I've seen like some speeches being done.
Yes, this is very good at Lowell House, and I don't know whether they welcome people from other houses or not, but it wouldn't be a bad thing to do in each house, is to have some version of practicing speaking. Lowell House has been doing that for some years. Now I want to spend the rest of the time on a subject which I feel is important, not just because of recent events, but because rhetoric has always been used as a way to address a community after a tragedy has occurred. That tragedy is very often unpredictable. Very often in retrospect, one could say we should have seen it coming, or the signs were there, why didn't we discover them or see them? But tragedies do occur. There may be some inevitability to them. That is to say, if we could put an end to all tragedies, we would have done so a long time ago. We don't seem capable of it. Whether it is some flaw in human nature, whether it is something in the fact that we have a very large country with more than 300 million people, and sooner or later someone is going to make a very rash, bad judgment about something and cause harm to many other people or threaten them, but it does happen. Most people my age, and I'm no exception, can remember exactly where they were when John Kennedy was assassinated. I was sitting in my 8th grade social studies class, and the announcement came over the loudspeaker, and then the whole school was let out. And since it was a couple hours before buses would usually run, everyone had to walk home. And I will never forget that walk home I took 2 miles to my house, and then meeting my mother and asking her if she knew what had happened, and she hadn't. I said the president was assassinated. The country experienced more assassinations in the 1960s. It has periodically witnessed and experienced assassinations. Recently, we experienced the massacre of 11 people in Pittsburgh in a synagogue. All of you were probably far too familiar with the idea of school shootings. You may have known individuals who've been involved in them. They seem not to be decreasing in number. They are terrible and tragic events. What can be done with language when these things happen? Sometimes silence is called for. Sometimes music is called for. Sometimes prayer is called for. And very often language is called for and needed. Because although it is inadequate, it is still necessary for people who survive a tragedy to talk to one another and to give comfort. It simply seems a human thing to do. I tried to express in the outline a little bit why this is important. It makes one think occasionally of literary tragedies which reflect real life. For example, the tragedy of King Lear, who divides his kingdom between 3 daughters, and essentially finds one daughter who doesn't flatter him to be unworthy, and therefore does not give her anything, and instead gives the 2 other daughters much. They then turn against him with their husbands, and eventually turn against one another. The family falls apart. The loyal daughter ends up dying, as does King Lear himself. There is chaos at the end of the play, and very few are left. And one who was loyal to King Lear, a man named Kent, says he is going away, and I think it's at least the way I interpret it, that he may very well be going away not only to get out of the scene, but perhaps even to commit suicide. He is so filled with despair. He is so saddened. He is so disheartened. So it is important after a tragedy to say things, because it is personal, it is communal. It reflects a certain kind of knowledge. Socrates says in the Symposium that a great playwright is capable of writing both tragedy and comedy. It's a very enigmatic remark. But one way to interpret it is that tragedy occurs when our knowledge and awareness of the world does not actually square with reality, and we or someone else acts in a way that simply does not register reality properly. And that action can harm others, can harm oneself too. That's tragic. But we've also seen instances in which a person doesn't recognize reality, they act in a certain way, and the result is comic. It's funny. We've all seen sitcoms in which someone does something because they don't realize what the actual situation is, and it's humorous, it's even farcical. Their knowledge has not squared with reality either. To know the real situation of things is an enormous challenge. This also brings in today questions of mental health. Someone who is not mentally well does not have a grip on real situations and reality. And that person may be entirely harmless, and that person may be capable of doing great harm. One of the things that language can do in the face of tragedy is provide some sense of release and catharsis. Catharsis is a term that Aristotle uses when he writes about Greek tragedy. There are different interpretations of it. One interpretation of it is that it is a release of emotion that has been pent up. It's a way of both expressing and externalizing that emotion so it doesn't eat into you, so it doesn't sicken you, so it doesn't turn into nothing but despair. In Shakespeare, there's a line where someone who has suffered much is sitting with a cap pulled down, just sitting. And another character says, "What man, ne'er pull your cap upon your brow, give sorrow words." In other words, express, vent, speak. Yes, it's inadequate. It will always be inadequate. But it is a way of addressing and communicating with others the fact that that kind of tragedy may indeed be felt by everyone. It is not unique. It is a human condition, and a terrible one. So it is possible, I think, to see, especially in retrospect, language as something that can provide a catharsis and also heal. If you read, for example, and I didn't assign it, but you might want to read it, read Edward Kennedy's speech on the death of his brother, John Kennedy, which I reference in that optional assignment in Norms of Rhetorical Culture. It is a remarkable address. Here is one of the things that Edward Kennedy said about his brother. He came to the presidency by the narrowest of margins. And that, in fact, is true. In fact, Nixon probably could have contested the election in Illinois because there were some irregularities. But Nixon said, "I'm not going to put the country through that." But when he was taken from us, our planet was more united in grief than it ever was in its grandest design. More united in grief. Moscow wept with Boston and with Dallas. In the years that followed, the feeling for him has not dimmed, but deepened. And today, from farthest church, in lands where hardly anyone speaks his language, they still hear his call. His presence continues to be so powerful because ideals can be shown far more vividly in one life than in all of the lofty theories. So whether you read that or whether you read Martin Luther King Jr. on the killing of those young girls by a bomb, in which he says there is a great democracy to death, and in which he says there is a way in which good is wrung out of evil. You read that, and I will not call it inspirational, but it is to a large degree comforting and reassuring. For then he also turns to the parents and families of those young girls and says, look how they did die. They died in church, they died with each other, they died worshiping, they died doing what they believed to be good and right. Not in some den or dive, he says. Not telling filthy stories to one another. He contrasts the virtuous quality of their lives with what others have done. And then he ends that address, interestingly enough, in the excerpt we have, with an actual quotation, or rather a paraphrase, as he puts it, from Hamlet. Good night, sweet prince, and may flights of angels take thee to thy rest. And King changes that to refer instead to the young girls who were killed in their passing. So it is a very hard thing for a community or a country to go through when people who are perfectly innocent, entirely innocent, find themselves, for whatever reason, put in the path of death and mortality and experience it, and others, for whatever reason, do not. And what does a community then need? It needs some address. It needs some words. It needs some comfort. Ronald Reagan knew this when the Challenger blew up. You don't remember that? You weren't born yet. 1986, I remember I was teaching, co-teaching with Bill Graham, and news came that the Challenger had blown up. Well, if you looked at the crew of that space shuttle in 1986, you would have seen a crew that actually did look very much like America. There were people from all around the country. There were people of different races and creeds and beliefs. There was a high school teacher. There was someone from Hawaii. I mean, there was all different notions of people, because they had specifically for that mission decided that they would pick a number of civilians and train them to go up in that shuttle. And then for various complicated, tragic reasons, that shuttle was launched at a temperature on that Florida morning that it never should have been launched at. And the O-ring that was cracked, and it caused the whole Challenger shuttle to explode and blow up, and all of those people were killed. And Reagan was to give, very shortly after that, a State of the Union address. But Reagan knew that that was not the thing to do. When a country experiences a tragedy, you don't just plow right ahead with business as usual. You do take a pause. And so instead of giving that State of the Union address, Reagan said something else. And he said something to the families of those who were lost, which is always appropriate. And then he says something very interesting to all of the young children who watched this on TV. It was all broadcast live. You saw the whole thing on live TV. And the announcers really didn't know what to say, because they'd never seen a launch like that, and no one wanted to believe that what was happening was happening. But it was. Reagan says, and I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it is hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. Then, near the end of this short address, he says there's a coincidence. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. Then he describes what Drake did in his explorations. That attitude was appropriate for the exploration of the space shuttle. Other tragedies and other deaths call upon a different kind of appropriate address to those who have survived and are still there. There may come a time in your life when you need to make such an address to someone, even if it's a private grief, even if it's something in the family. And I do think there comes a time in a nation when we all need to pause and at least hear those addresses or make them to one another, because there is a community of good in the world. There really is. And it doesn't belong to just one specific group or type of person. There is a community of virtue in the world. It exists. It's very real. And every once in a while, it is hurt or dented by some malicious action. When that occurs, it's important to say something. It's important to speak up, to give comfort, and to heal.